we can take our engineering hat that we've used to build successful software systems and apply them to the human systems, right? Bottleneck detection, right? One of the primary issues with scaling the software system over time is identifying before they kick you in the teeth where those bottlenecks are and frankly moving them, right? We remove this bottleneck and move it upstream further. And the same thing now in our software development lifecycle.
Exactly.
Where is our real bottleneck? How do we focus on those things, not just throw a bunch of AI agents at it and see what happens? Yeah.
Hey, everybody, and welcome to the next episode of the Build and Breakthrough podcast, where we celebrate founders' successes and struggles. I'm Hunter Harris of Hunter Software Consulting, and with me today is Scott Mitchell. Scott Mitchell is a Fulcrum Equity Venture Partner, one of the advisors at the Atlanta Tech Village, a coach and advisor for CTOs, and someone near and dear to my heart. I mean, I've known you for a huge part of my engineering career. You were a mentor to me, as you have been to a number of people in my network. And I just wanted to take the opportunity to get you on the podcast and really share some of the wisdom that I've really enjoyed with my network at large. So, Scott, do you want to introduce yourself?
I think you covered it pretty well. Thanks for having me, Hunter. And yes, we do go back a ways. Obviously, we spent time together at SalesLoft, but also the time at Silverpop before that. And I guess the thing I'll throw on top of all that you said is I sort of fell into an interesting professional niche across 20 years in the SaaS software business, right? SalesLoft kind of was the third thing that defined the pattern, right? But the pattern I fell into was joining startups that had product market fit already and were ready to scale. And each one of them went better along the way. Much of that has to do with the company's own product decisions and leadership decisions. I was fortunate to learn a few things along the way as well, and through painful mistakes and all sorts of ways to gain experience, and happy to share some thoughts on those things as we talk.
Yeah, that's very interesting because I feel like I've accidentally done the exact same thing. I feel like everywhere I've joined, I've really kind of hit some aspect of that scaling. And man, I have to say, I personally have greatly benefited from people like you, Steve Bussey, Ben Olive, various people at Calendly and Sendoso as well. So, I mean, I'm honored to be able to participate in all of these startup success stories. So jumping into it, a lot of the people I talk to are pretty early in their startup journey, but a lot of them are accruing technical talent. Some of them have technical co-founders, some of them are technical themselves, but a lot of people are talking about like CTO roles, fractional CTOs, interim CTOs, and really kind of that niche. Do you want to give your version of like, what is a CTO? Like, why do people need CTOs? What is the role of a CTO? What differentiates a CTO from like a CPO and some of the other roles on the executive board
or even just from a senior engineer even, right?
Well, yeah, part is what's the difference between like a CTO and a principal engineer and a founding engineer?
Yeah, I think the CTO role is super interesting. One, it's remarkably stage dependent, right? In those initial startups that we have a tendency to see at Atlanta Tech Village, right? They are the engineering team, frankly, at least in the very beginning, right? They're the one that provides the first sounding board for the other co-founder to say, what's the technical feasibility of this thing, right? They are also most likely the hands-on keyboard building that initial MVP, right? Unless we want to say Claude is the hands-on keyboard or something like that. But anyway, you can kind of have a virtual engineering team these days. But that initial stage is very much you need a person who can build the system. Hopefully they've got more capabilities in that, but that's the key, the crux of it. As the company grows, that very much shifts, right? You know, that initial stage, you've gotten your MVP out, you found some level of success, you're starting to hire people. And all of a sudden that CTO is not just the engineer. They're very much shifting more into that architect advisor type of guiding the course of the technology, but also building teams, hiring and firing, setting direction, and building up their management and leadership chops as well, right? And then that scale just shifts more and more as you become more successful as a company, right? And so one of the things that I find interesting now is how different the CTO is, to your point, versus the CFO and the CMO and the other executive team members, right? Everybody else on that executive team is a business person who learned their domain, whether that's sales or marketing or whatever, where the CTO is a person who got really good at programming and was elevated to a point where they're now having to learn how to be a business person and provide that same type of input at the executive level, right? So it is a very different conversation for what it means to achieve and kind of integrate the skills needed to be a really good executive partner when you're at that higher stage, right? You're in that 40, 50, $100 million type of revenue. Early stages, not nearly as different a beast, if that makes sense, because usually it's you and your co-founder, maybe some board members, maybe you're slowly bringing on a fractional financial leader or something like that. How does that resonate with the experience you've had advising other startups and in your own professional experience?
That tracks. There's one kind of refinement that I'd like to see if this resonates with you.
Yeah.
So one of the things that I think about right now, and you kind of made me think of this with the mention of Claude specifically, I think a lot less about coding itself and more about responsibility these days. So what you were saying about like building the product and then transitioning to building systems, one of the things that kind of leapt out at me is if you abstract that a little bit, because, like I love living in a world of abstractions, right?
Yep.
If you articulate the responsibilities more as something along the lines of starting with the responsibility of building systems, does that not kind of remain the same throughout there? The systems being building systems for autonomously coding to begin with, building systems for people to be autonomously coding for you, building systems for people to have people autonomously coding for you. I mean, I think that's always been kind of true to a certain extent, right? Because
Sure. 100%.
I feel like to the point of both of us kind of hitting that niche of scaling, I feel like that is always a critical point where there's sort of like a lack of a system that works for a particular period of time. And then when you hit that scaling point, the lack of a system is really what starts hurting you the most. You're like, we kind of lucked into this. We haven't run into too many terrible brick walls, but now to actually survive the 100 to a million scaling curve here, we really have to figure out what we're missing, what we need to implement so that this is a repeatable process. And so that like some cowboy doesn't just get lost off in the wilderness for the next 45 days or whatever. Like when you're really reporting, you need legibility and visibility into what the organization's actually doing, right?
Yeah. I think you're right. There's systems thinking throughout, right?
Mm-hmm.
They're very different systems. And I think back to your responsibilities point, that initial CTO and that initial startup, the real primary responsibility is delivering the product.
Absolutely.
In a SaaS startup, right? And so that responsibility doesn't go away. It gets refined and broken down into finer parts and deployed to different parts of the system. And I think about that the kind of human system you're hinting at as several different real distinct aspects that are co-collaborators, right? You've got your org design itself. How have you chosen to break out sort of the management structure of the team and any functional carve outs, if you will, right? Engineering, DevOps, maybe data science is sitting off on its own, whatever. You've got your agile system, right? Your software development life cycle. How do we actually go from product ideas to running code in production, right? And that area is so up in the air right now. And I'm looking forward to some interesting conversations with folks around that topic real soon.
I talk so much about that specifically these days because it's so interesting. I could talk about SDLC stuff all day, but it's it's completely changed, but it's also kind of very the same as it has been. It's like the more the same than it has been in a way, which is insane.
What I've always enjoyed is how we can take our engineering hat that we've used to build successful software systems and apply them to the human systems, right?
Exactly.
Bottleneck detection, right? And mitigation. One of the primary issues with scaling the software system over time is identifying before they kick you in the teeth where those bottlenecks are and frankly moving them, right? We remove this bottleneck and move it upstream further, or it shifts to another part of the platform. And the same thing now in our software development lifecycle.
Exactly.
Where is our real bottleneck? How do we focus on those things, not just throw a bunch of AI agents at it and see what happens? Yeah, super interesting topic.
You actually kind of like hit one of my like trap cards here kind of perfectly, because I would love to know also if this resonates with you, but I have a personal belief that a lot more people are engineers than they realize, because I feel like that what you've just laid out there, that sort of systems thinking as it applies to engineering, I've worked with so many incredible people that have that exact same sort of like systems thinking, basically like engineering brain, but outside of
Mhm.
engineering. So a great example is one of the people that I worked with over at Sendoso in the BizOps role. She was just locked into that systems-based thinking, and as a result,
Mhm.
she was an incredible value add for all of these projects that I was working on. Where I, for example, was wondering, okay, I need to build this particular thing, but what's the associated ROI? How does this interface with our like warehouse logistics systems? If I do this software change, what are the physical ramifications in terms of the business operations here? And she was just
Yeah.
fully locked in to give me that sort of information, to where like it's one thing to be able to view those sorts of things in software, but you still have to consider like the real life impact to your customers. In this case, because we had a warehouse, there were physical
Mhm.
concerns that had to be accounted for. Like to your point about bottlenecks, if we hyper optimize warehouse management to a certain extent, does that actually mean that we need to reorganize the warehouse? Do our actual physical systems for physical delivery of these things, can they match the software delivery lifecycle? Or is it a system where, because we've optimized the part that doesn't need to be optimized, does that actually result in exacerbating downstream bottlenecks, for
Right.
example?
Right.
Like
Right.
that's an incredibly fascinating aspect of all of this.
Yeah, I definitely think there are great systems thinkers that you encounter across business, right? I think of a woman I worked with at SalesLoft who took on so many different roles, and one of the reasons she could was she was a great systems thinker, right? That ability to show up in a group, learn the domain, understand how they do what they do, and optimize their process, right? How
Absolutely.
they go about doing it is a gift. Whether I call that engineering or not, I don't really care. I think they're just really good problem solvers, understanding root cause. How do you think systemically,
Hmm.
systematically? Either way, it's a particular mindset. And I did a presentation of last year at one point that was sort of talking about leadership through the lens of engineering software patterns,
Hmm.
because that's how my brain works, right? And so how we can take these things we've always learned and been trained about good patterns and anti-patterns and apply them to human systems as well, right? It's an interesting bridge, in particular for people of our mindset moving into leadership, right? It's not all foreign territory. Some of what we learned is actually valuable in this new domain as well.
Yeah, I find that fascinating because I've seen the same thing over and over and over. N- Talking about AI a little bit on this particular vein, do you have any thoughts towards that sort of systems thinking? Because I have a really strong opinion at the moment that these sorts of people, like regardless of engineering expertise or not, if you're using something like Claude Code or agentic coding tools or whatever, basically vibe coding, and you have this systems thinking, I think that really sets you up for success, even if you don't necessarily know a ton about the specific syntax. Versus, I see other demographics that kind of let the AI itself kind of drive them as opposed to the
Right,
opposite.
right.
What sort of breakdown are you seeing? I mean, I know you talk to a ton of CTOs. Like, are you seeing that same sort of breakdown or along those sort of mindset boundaries, or are there other kind of like demographic breakdowns that you're seeing?
Yeah, I think for the most part, the CTOs I work with who are exploring this space are already bringing a systems mindset to it. And yeah,
Okay,
the tool is
good.
not going to kind of wag them off course, right? It's not going to be the tail wagging the dog. But I also work with early stage founders and some other just friends who, even if they have a systems thinking mindset, may have gaps in knowledge that are a real problem,
Hmm.
right? And I think more what I'm seeing is more on the operational side. Great, you can write software. What does it mean to know that that software is actually successful in production, and knowing even how to ask the question? The good news is the tools can do a lot of the right things if you ask them to. They
But
can
you do have to
clarify
phrase it
things.
correctly.
Exactly. And I'm a little uncomfortable with any of these tools having direct access to production in general.
No.
Right.
Listeners, if you're listening, don't give it direct access to production. I mean, we were talking about that incident that one of the founders in my network had the other day about how he managed to do a schema migration on his database for the wrong code base. And as a result, just wiped out his whole database and had 24 hours of outage.
Yeah. Which can be company ending depending on how well your other operational practices are working, right? Which I guess my point being is a lot of people are now seeing this as a coding exercise and not realizing that there's a lot bigger picture than just writing code that makes an app run, right?
Right.
And that's the gap I'm seeing.
There's an aspect of like the SDLC, the software development lifecycle, but there's also the software development value chain. And as we've been hinting at with bottlenecks, the theory of constraints, if you are a company and you have no coding talent, getting coding talent via Cloud Code is fantastic. But also, if you've already gotten let's take SalesLoft, for example. I think if we took coding tools and just put them into SalesLoft and changed nothing else about like the QA process or the product process, I mean, I had pretty personal direct experience with causing damage to the organization just by optimizing the wrong bottleneck, right? Like, I imagine the QA team would have been thrashed pretty badly if we just did that with no other associated changes.
I was on, and yes, to SalesLoft, I was on a call with one of my CTOs yesterday, and they're in the midst of now needing to optimize that QA stage of their software cycle because of their gained efficiency on the engineering side. 100%. That's exactly the problem. And the instinct isn't necessarily, you've got to really think clearly about it. You can't get lost in the trenches and miss the big picture, right? I do think, to your point, there's also a bottleneck in the early stage, which is, do we know what to build, what it should look like? I think team design is going to be super interesting going forward. And I think product managers are more important than ever, if I'm honest.
100% agree.
People who actually have the mindset of writing in detail what it is they want and figuring out what they want too, which is hard, the hardest part, I think. But Lord knows, having really clearly identified what you are trying to accomplish is more important than ever. Also because you don't have another human there to riff with necessarily if you're handing this stuff off to a Claude or whatever tool.
Or at least you have to do the riffing in advance in some capacity, right?
Right, exactly.
I'd love to get your thinking because I guess we've both alluded to this a little bit. So you mentioned QA bottlenecks. One pattern that I'm seeing very frequently in the startups that I'm talking to is that really the QA bottleneck, it's not always caused by upstream issues, but frequently it is. The typical pattern that I see is engineering, coding, throughput is optimized for, creates, I think the term is siphon pressure, but basically it creates a sucking action on product. Product gets pulled into the weeds, and in some organizations, product gets pulled into execution where they're incentivized to go do coding as well. And as a result, the throughput increases, the siphoning factor increases as well.
The queue stalls, right?
The queue stalls, but also it's not necessarily that work builds up in QA per se, but it's that the size of work grows because the size of the work is more and more addressable. And as a result, QA itself is stalled due to having large change sets that they can't necessarily easily evaluate. Then, as opposed to the queue stalling, which is actually a better result than what actually happens, things start getting rubber stamped in the PR review and the QA step. And then things flow directly to production, and then the customers do QA for you.
I'm 100% seeing that in the review step, and had a really interesting conversation with, again, another CTO, completely different. We were talking about, what does grooming mean in this world? And
man.
One of the elements they're adding to their grooming is what's the right amount of work to put into the agent's hands so that we get output that is actually reviewable, right? It's the kind of classic, to your point, right? If the PR is so big, nobody completely has the time, let's be honest, or energy to fully grok it, and it gets rubber stamped, as opposed to if we can create things that are more bite-sized. I don't know what the right answer is, if I'm honest, but I think it brings interesting challenges to address to what we've sort of all presumed an agile life cycle looks like.
I mean, I don't think there is a right answer, right? If you're in a company that doesn't have active users, then rubber stamping stuff isn't really the end of the world, right? I mean, I don't know how you have a substantial engineering team and a built out process without active customers, but some people end up in that situation. That's pretty rare. But if you
Yeah.
do have active customers, I mean,
Well, there
everything in
is a tipping
engineering.
point. Forget active customers or not, right? I very much remember the tipping point at SalesLoft where we realized we needed to add more rigor because the size of our existing customer base was significantly larger than the revenue we were going to bring in from new customers over the next 6 months.
Mm-hmm.
So ensuring they were happy was a higher priority than ensuring that a new feature for a prospect was built, right? So you found this balance. It goes in so many ways, and it's not just software engineering, right? How many contracts did we review and look at and have the conversation about whether conversation I used to always had with our general counsel is like, all right, what's the cost of being wrong here?
Mm-hmm.
If we sign this contract with the terms that we don't love, what's the trade-off, right? And what's the balance? And the answer
Absolutely.
is, well, if we sign that and they're unhappy, they can churn anytime they want. That's a very quantifiable risk that's not very large. Or if we go this route with this contract and we violate GDPR and we can get sued for X times our annual revenue, that's a very different risk conversation, right? And so, yeah, everything is about balancing the risks, and the risks evolve and change rather dynamically.
Very much so. I agree. So, this is another topic that we've kind of gone around a little bit here. But one of the things that was remarkable for SalesLoft to me was the engineering culture overall. What are your thoughts on, to the point about like building systems and the human element here?
Mm-hmm.
What's your thinking about engineering culture, especially now? Like, what do you think are really the core ingredients in building a really great engineering?
Yeah, and the good news is I don't think the technical tooling changes greatly impacts what I think about engineering culture either.
I
I think
agree.
first we have to acknowledge that SalesLoft was fairly unique in that it was very intentionally built on a set of company core values. And
Mm-hmm.
that it flowed out into everything we did, including the hiring process. And so every new hire, whether it was a C-suite executive to a entry level first job of their career, got the same core values interview, and
Mm-hmm.
those core values panelists could reject any client, any prospect. So that was a great foundation to build on, and I really value that now and have taken a lot of lessons learned. Having said that, then we had our own values, right, in engineering. And I think for me, it really, really comes back to kind of a central idea that how to invest into people a sense of ownership and purpose, right?
Mm-hmm.
And so that they're vested. And I don't mean ownership from an equity perspective, although that can be a component of it, but that's not what I mean. But the idea that, for me, the way I've chosen to generally do it is break it down functionally and make sure teams have ownership of part of the code base so that they, and not just the code base, the functionality, right? The engineers and their product manager counterparts own the dialer at SalesLoft or the email capability or the CRM integration. And it brings with it a couple of realizations. One, the code's not going to get better unless they make it better, right? There's nobody riding to the rescue. So if you're unhappy with it, fix it. You're the only ones who are going to do it. So fight for that need to fix it. It means that you spend time understanding what your customers really need in a very narrow domain, right? You need to understand the big picture, but you get to have this focus that you can really bring real clarity. And now you have real purpose. How do I make this the best multi-master bidirectional sync with CRM in the space, right? And so if we can get that going, you kind of naturally start to align incentives, right? And get people sort of pulling in the same direction. And so then from a goal setting perspective, I really love OKRs. And what we always were trying to do was say, we've got this top down, right? Company is setting OKRs and the departments are finding ways to support the OKRs. But at the same time, engineering teams have a set of things they know need to have to accomplish in their own domain. And we need to find this balance of kind of top down, bottoms up setting and aligning of goals so that we're not always just forging ahead, building new features blindly, but we're also taking care of the things the teams have identified, which by the way, might be new features that the top level hasn't identified, new opportunities. But a lot of times, right, it's that architectural projects, it's tech debt, it's just pure maintenance and making sure that there's a healthy system that we can continue to build on top of. So I think it comes down to those two things, right? Purpose and ownership. So somewhere you throw in the word autonomy as well. All of that one's a
Yeah,
challenge.
autonomy was the other one that I was going to add to that specifically.
Yeah.
And
Although
I was,
it's scoped autonomy, right?
yes, of course. You can't just
Yeah.
go off into the West and do whatever you want.
Right.
It's like,
Exactly.
yeah, it is guardrailed, but still present.
I guess
And
you
that,
have to align autonomy and accountability, right?
yes,
You
exactly.
set goals, you're accountable to those goals. You have a lot of autonomy to achieve those goals in the way you see best,
Hmm.
make the best outcome.
I'd also be remiss if, talking about the five dysfunctions of the team, if we don't mention trust too, which I feel like trust
Sure.
was in a large part infused into the organization through the core values interview, because that really allowed us to at least start from a common vocabulary. I mean, I've been, for my business, I've been working on a core values thing for a couple of weeks now. And interestingly enough, two of my core values are not word for word stolen from SailSoft, because it's not customer first. I think it's community first at the moment. And
Mm-hmm.
no, it's team over self is community over self, I think. I have to go look at the specific document. But basically, I'm stealing two of the core values because
Fair.
it turns out they're very important to me.
Right. Right. And I think the interesting thing is also, how do you build trust at scale? Right.
It's
And
tough.
that was an interesting thing. The whole journey with SalesLoft was interesting because we just kept, the growth was so rapid, you had to continually work to stay ahead of what was breaking. And I think a really central thing that we adopted as an executive team was the idea of transparency and vulnerability,
Hmm.
right? If we could be super open, inherently we built trust. It was, how did that manifest? It manifests in all sorts of ways. One, from sharing our personal stories and how we got to be where we are and the challenges we faced. It meant admitting that we didn't have all the answers.
Hmm.
It meant owning mistakes we made, right? So there are all sorts of ways that we sort of kind of opened the kimono, right? And made sure that people had full visibility. We shared financial data very openly for a long time.
Long time.
Yeah. And so I think it helped engender trust, knowing that if there was something wrong, we were going to tell people and that we didn't have all the answers and that we were all trying to figure this out in real time.
I think you mentioned something very interesting there too, because you mentioned previously the combination of leading top down and leading bottom up as well. I feel like leading with the vulnerability and transparency as well really gave, like, not like M or C titled individuals, but really like IC individuals, individual contributors, really gave permission to them to similarly be transparent and vulnerable, which in turn fed into that practice of leading from the bottom up to kind of meet in the middle, which
Mm-hmm.
that is another concept that I've really brought to every company that I've worked with since then. But like a process of trying to build a culture where that meet in the middle can happen, because yeah, you can lead from the top down. It's possible, but it can go wrong in kind of like a tyrannical way, which is bad. And leading from the bottom up, you can do that too, but there's a number of failure states where you have decision by consensus, and
Right.
both of those end up really being anti-patterns when you really try to scale. And
Yeah.
meeting in the middle is, it's tough, and it takes regular, consistent work. But man, when you hit that point, things just really hum. But you have to put in the work, and if you have to keep on putting in the work
100%.
week after day, week after week, month after month.
Yeah, agreed. And I think setting that example of transparency and vulnerability, to your point, works at the IC level as well, both from what you mentioned as giving kind of feedback up the chain, but also in building really strong teams peer to peer,
Yes.
right? And think about all the kind of intentional team offsites and exercises that were done to really make sure those teams were well bonded, right?
Hmm.
We talked a lot about first team, right? Who's your first team? And in that case, those delivery teams needed to be able to have really healthy conflict.
Hmm.
You needed to be able to debate and disagree and decide and move forward. And that is all built on a foundation of trust, that people have good intentions, right? And that they're not looking just to get somebody. They're all pulling in the same direction. Again, that shared sense of purpose to get to a
Hmm.
common destination. Yep.
Yeah, the shared sense of advocating for the customer from different points of view. Like I really felt like the core value of customers first was that really helped as a kind of a north star for those conversations specifically. Because if you had that sort of conflict, you could always bring the core values into those conversations as a guiding principle and say, for example, like, hey, I'm not trying to be personal here. I'm advocating for the customer because I've seen them acting in this particular way. And they can say, I got it, but I've seen the customer act in this other way. And I'm also acting based on these principles.
And then when you identified that people were just thrashing, somebody could lean in and say, hey man, bias towards action. Let's make a decision. Let's go.
Yes, exactly.
The thing I thought was really cool about the core values was that they held each other in tension.
Yes.
And I remember asking Rob Foreman, one of the co-founders, one day, I explained it, I laid it out for him. Customer first and bias towards action. They hold each other in tension, right? If you're running too fast and being too haphazard, you're actually hurting customers. But also, if you're hemming and hawing and trying to make sure everything's absolutely perfect, you aren't actually shipping anything. So those two hold each other in tension. And then team over self that you referenced earlier, and focus on results. You can be so team over self that you forget that you're accountable to deliver some sort of outcome and not do your job. So you need to be focused on results as well as supporting your teammates. And so I asked Rob, I'm like, these look like they were just made to hold each other in tension. Was that intentional? He's like, yeah, sure it was. It's like, so it wasn't intentional, but it made a system that was really, really effective. And interestingly, right? What was the fifth core value? Do you remember?
I don't remember now. It's been too long.
Half full. And the truth was,
right.
Glass half full is the only one that didn't have a counter active core value. It really ran amok. It was the one core value that caused us problems.
Really?
Yep. It made us too ready to ignore things that were challenging out there and just say, it's all going to be okay, right? And so we struggled with that one for years. And I think in the end, this is a realization I've had since leaving, again, back to being in the trenches to getting to tunnel vision, right? Is that I think part of the problem was it didn't have something that could counteract it, where the other four balanced each other.
This is a realization that I'm having live now because I hadn't considered that. And now that clarifies a number of things for me, actually.
That's cool. Yeah, interesting stuff. It was a great experience. I mean, like any company is a lab experiment, right?
Right.
Nobody has all the answers and you're just trying things to see what works and you're taking your experiences to try to inform those experiments. But there was a lot of goodness in that one and a lot of, again, the growth caused all sorts of interesting stresses on all of your experiments, and things that worked 6 months ago weren't guaranteed to continue working.
Yeah, it means you can't take anything for granted. You have to just hit the ground running, keep on running. And what's the metaphor? Keep on building the plane as you're flying it, right?
Yeah. Which is a great analogy for building SaaS software, but also for building a rapidly changing and growing company as well. Yep.
Absolutely.
Again, another way the human systems align to the technical systems.
Well, Scott, I want to be respectful of your time. Do you want to plug your pluggables?
Sure. Really informal. I spend most of my time coaching young technology executives. Like I've said, they're a very different looking beast on the executive team, and helping them build those skills so that they can stay in seat as their company grows. So if anybody's interested in chatting about that, the easiest way is to hit me up on LinkedIn and see if I can maybe be of service.
Well, Scott, thank you very much for coming on here. This has been fantastic. I think that there's just a ton here for founders to look at. And for everyone watching the podcast, thank you very much for watching. I hope you've gotten a lot out of this. I've loved this conversation, and I hope all of you have a fantastic day. Peace.